Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us here today for this special edition of Coffee and Conversation, just in time for the academic relief package. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dana Saunders, and I'm the director of the Students First Office here at UNCG in the Division of Student Success. And one of my responsibilities is coordinating this Coffee and Conversation roundtable series for both professional and faculty advisors every semester. So for those of you who are frequent visitors to the Coffee and Conversation, welcome back. I know we've got a lot of new folks here today that haven't been able to join us earlier in the semester, given the importance of the topic at hand today. So thanks so much for joining us. If you are just signing in, please be sure to let us know that you're here today by completing the sign-in, which I've put in the link in the chat. And before we get started, I've got just a couple of housekeeping things. So again, for those of you who've joined us for the Coffee and Conversation series this semester, you know that I often serve as moderator for these discussions, but we bring in guest facilitators for our dialogue series. Today, I have the esteemed pleasure of serving in a dual role, so you'll be hearing a lot from me today as both facilitator, hoping to answer many, if not all, of your questions about the academic relief package for fall 2020 and how all of it's going to work. I've got some PowerPoint slides that I'll be sharing here to sort of get started with our discussion, but please be sure to ask questions. This is really intended to be a Q&A and a dialogue throughout our time together. So don't hesitate to interrupt as I'm sharing information with you today. You are welcome to unmic and ask your question aloud. That's a great way to get the discussion going. I will also keep an eye on the chat for any questions that come in that way. And I know I've tapped a couple of you all to be sure to help me as those are coming in, since I'll be also sort of having one eye on the PowerPoint and one eye on the slides, at least, or I'm sorry, on the chat, at least initially. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that we've got representatives from the University Registrar's Office here today, as well as the Financial Aid Office. So I know you all may have questions that kind of creep into those areas. And so appreciate having their expertise here to lend today. As with everything right now in pandemic times with the academic relief package, it's definitely taken a village. And I'll just remind you that it has literally been 2 weeks since the emergency meeting where Faculty Senate passed the academic relief package 2 weeks ago. So there has been lots going on behind the scenes. I will also use that as a disclaimer to mention that there may be some questions that you asked today that we don't yet know, but we'll also commit to hunting down the answers and making sure we get that information out to all of you and the rest of the advising community before the academic relief package officially opens for students to begin opting into next week. Last but not least, I'll just mention that, I don't think I've mentioned this already, but I'll mention that we are recording this session today as we do all of our Coffee and Conversation roundtable discussions. And I will be distributing that recording along with the PowerPoint slides and any other resources that we talk through today by end of day tomorrow. So hopefully you can continue to use those as a resource as you're working with students and engaging in the advisor review, which of course we'll talk about at length. So any questions on that or things that I can answer before we jump right in? All right, awesome. So I am going to share my screen, some of the most common words on Zoom these days. Just give me a second. All right, can folks give me a thumbs up that you can see my slides and not presenter view, which is always my fancy trick that I usually do. Awesome, great, thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to jump right into the academic relief package today. And again, as you all have questions, please don't hesitate to unmic and ask your question aloud. I know we've got a lot of folks in the room today, so if you want to put them in the chat, please be sure to do that as well. Hopefully these will kind of get the questions brewing. I know some of you also submitted questions ahead of time, which I really appreciated, and I think we'll be able to answer all those today. But please don't hesitate to chime in, and don't feel like you have to wait till the end, although we'll certainly leave time at the end for questions as well. So let's see. So here's what we're going to walk through today. We're going to start with a very brief overview of the components of the fall 2020 version of the academic relief package. It is different from the options that we had made available for students in the spring and summer. And so I think that's really important to emphasize moving forward. So we'll briefly talk about that. I'm going to share a little bit about the academic relief package timeline and deadlines that we're going to, that will be important for both you all as advisors and as well as students moving forward. Some of these deadlines are things that have already been sort of out there on the academic relief package and other things, but some of them will be new to you and kind of more internal deadlines as we're working through the advisor review process and the finalizing of student records. I'm going to very briefly just mention the resources that are available now, just to make sure that everybody's aware of the documents and resources and guidance that is out there for students and for you all as advisors right now. But then hopefully we'll spend a lot of the time today talking through the logistics of the advisor review, what that will actually look like, kind of the structure that we're trying to put in place for that. Knowing that we have a very decentralized academic advising structure here at UNCG, where things look and feel different in all of our schools and colleges, and making sure we accommodate for that, but are sort of meeting the spirit of the policy that's been put in place and the emphasis on that advisor review. We'll talk through kind of the big opt-out and opt-in scenarios for students, which are essentially, I think, will give you all as advisors some guidance on the things to look for as you're doing the advisor review for students who you work with as your advisees. And then last but not least, we'll talk through the academic relief package wrap up and kind of final steps. And definitely hope to leave time for questions at the end, but again, don't hesitate to ask questions throughout as well. All right. So let's jump right in. I don't want to spend too much time because I suspect and hope that many, if not all of us, already have a pretty decent grasp on the different components of the academic relief package. But the big components start with a limited opt-in option to satisfactory, unsatisfactory grading for our students. The threshold in which a student can choose a satisfactory grade or an unsatisfactory grade remains the same as it was in the spring and the summer. So students who've earned a C- grade or higher are able to opt in to satisfactory grading. Unlike their letter grades, it will not impact their GPA. For students who've earned a D+ grade or below, they're able to opt in to unsatisfactory grading. Again, it will not impact their GPA, but of significant importance is that all unsatisfactory grading results in 0 credit earned. So think of it really kind of like a withdrawal. That's especially important to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but particularly for students that have perhaps earned a passing grade, a D+, a D, or a D-, they really need to think long and hard about if keeping that credit and whatever requirements that credit is meeting is more important than maybe the negative impact that the grade is having on their GPA itself. So satisfactory grades, you get to keep the credit. It doesn't impact your GPA. Unsatisfactory grades, you don't get to keep the credit and it doesn't impact your GPA. Big difference from the spring and summer is that students are limited to a 2-course maximum, so 2 courses that they can opt into satisfactory or unsatisfactory grading for the fall term. I know there's been a lot of confusion about the language that is 2 courses or up to 8 hours, so maybe it's easier to think of it in terms of 2 grades. They can opt into satisfactory, unsatisfactory grading for 2 of their final grades that they receive at the end of the term. And if that's a 2 credit hour course, fine. If that's a 1 credit hour course, fine. If that's a 4 credit hour course, fine, but only 2 grades. So as they're thinking about their opt-in choices, and as you're guiding students in that, it's important to sort of think about where's the most bang for their buck across all of those scenarios. Also of critical importance and difference from the spring and summer academic relief package is that our academic programs now have discretion to decide if a satisfactory grade meets program requirements. So if it, many of our programs require that students need a C or higher to meet prerequisites, to fulfill major requirements, or for secondary admission criteria. And in the spring and the summer, the institution just said institutionally an essay grade will meet all of those. Now programs and departments have the discretion to decide if that is in fact the case. And all of our departments are sort of grappling with that right now. Many have already made decisions. Some still are deciding. And one reason why sort of that's a challenge is because of limitations that exist in Banner, and also because of really a precedent that we set with what the essay grade means in spring and summer. If programs decide that an essay grade will not meet prerequisites or major requirements, that's not something that can be centrally handled by the University Registrar's Office. That's something that the departments will need to continue to monitor and enforce moving forward. So that's an important distinction there. And we'll talk a little bit more about what programs are deciding about essay grades here in just a little bit. And then last but not least, probably the thing that brings us all here today, and that is that different from spring and summer, the satisfactory, unsatisfactory grading now incorporates an advisor review after opt-in selections are made. So students will opt in to their satisfactory grading of their, or unsatisfactory grading of their choice for their 2 courses in UNCG, very similar to how they would have did in the spring and summer. But now, sort of before that is officially official, there will be this advisor review component, which of course we'll talk about here in just a little bit. More to come on that. Let's see. So another big component in the academic relief package has to do with course withdrawal. So for fall 2020, all WX grades, which essentially are the withdrawals that students initiated on their own in UNCG before the published deadline to withdraw without a WF, those will automatically be converted to what we call WE grades, or courses with exception. WE grades are important because they're excluded from GPA calculation, and they're also excluded from the 16-hour course withdrawal limit that students currently have in place at UNCG for the duration of their undergraduate career. So obviously this package was passed long after the WX deadlines for this term. So the Registrar's Office has been very hard at work already converting those WX grades to WE grades. I believe they have completed that process. It was like 16 hours worth of manual work, literally changing every single grade. So you may see more and more WE grades for students that you knew had already withdrawn from courses. That will continue into the spring. I won't talk much about spring now because I think we're really just trying to focus on what happens over the next 3 weeks. But WX grades are automatically being converted to WE grades for fall 2020. We do have students that have WF grades for the term because they chose to withdraw after that deadline, and WF grades are pretty detrimental to students because they calculate into their GPA just like they do just as they would if it was an F grade. So we're doing what's called an expedited course withdrawal request for fall 2020 WF grades only. The course withdrawal request, I'm guessing many of you are familiar in some way, shape, or form with this appeal process, but it's coordinated through the Students First Office and generally requires a committee review with a letter of explanation, documentation, feedback from instructors. We are expediting that review for fall 2020 grades only, so any student who withdrew from one or more courses through the last day of classes this semester. And that process is already underway. We had a little more than 170 students withdraw with WF grades this term. They've already gotten outreach from our office inviting them to complete the expedited course withdrawal request process. I think we've heard from more than 30 right now, which is great. So we're working really hard to move students through that process so that they can take advantage of no GPA penalty for their W grades. Questions about that? Great. And then last but not least, I won't talk too much about this today, but the academic relief package does offer some new grade replacement flexibility. This was not something that was incorporated into spring and summer, and actually was motivated by some flexibility that came from the UNC system office, which has some sort of overarching policies surrounding grade replacement that dictate what UNCG can offer in terms of grade replacement. And so what the grade replacement flexibility offers in this relief package is that it excludes any courses that students have taken in the spring, so last spring, this fall, and next spring from counting towards that 3-course grade replacement limit that UNCG currently has for our grade replacement policy. So if they took courses this semester, kept grades that they don't really like, D grades, F grades, but choose to repeat those in a future semester and replace the grade, submit a grade replacement request at that time, it will not count against their 3-course limit. And the Academic Policies and Regulations Committee is working to update our existing policy language to clearly state that. But for now, just know that that's part of the academic relief package. And so stay tuned for more on that. There was a question that was submitted in advance, which was a really good one. And that was a question about what about summer? Because obviously we had an academic relief package in the summer, and COVID was still happening in the summer. And as of right now, summer is not included in the excluded semesters for grade replacement. We think that was likely an inadvertent omission from the UNC system office. So we followed up with them to ask for clarification and perhaps permission to expand the flexibility to include summer. So we hope to have an update on that very soon. But as of right now, only courses taken in spring 2020, fall 2020, and spring 2021 are included in that grade replacement flexibility. All right, so what's not included, we've talked a little bit about this, but just sort of to highlight the big points, there's no limitless opt-in option this semester. You know, in the spring and in the summer, whether a student was enrolled in 2 courses, 10 courses, 4 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours, they could opt into SA US grading for any and all of those courses. Again, that's not the case this time around. 2 grades. 2 grades is all that they can opt into for fall 2020. There's no automatic WE opt-in option for fall 2020 final grades. I think this is really important to emphasize to students and may come as a surprise to them when they log into UNCG next week and start to make their opt-in selections. The only options that they will see for fall 2020 is keeping their existing letter grade or opting in to whichever SA or US grade is appropriate because of what their letter grade is. They will not see an option to withdraw. So I think that's really important to emphasize to students. Of course, our existing course withdrawal request still exists for students that want to go through that, particularly if they choose the US grade, but decide they still want to be officially withdrawn from that course instead. But it's not an automatic option that students will be able to opt into. And the other thing that I'll mention is that there's no extended deadline to resolve incomplete grades awarded for fall 2020. Incomplete grade extensions was an option that was sort of at the front and center of our spring and summer academic relief packages, but it's not included as a component this go around. So we'll revert back to our normal 6-month timeline for resolving incomplete grades unless an extension has been granted at the discretion of the faculty member. Okay, any questions? I haven't been seeing any questions in the chat, but I just want to double check. Okay, great. So let's talk about timeline. So here are some key dates and deadlines to be aware of moving forward. First of all, sort of the official kickoff for the academic relief package will be when final grades are due on Tuesday, December 8th. And if you are a faculty member, I know we've got a lot of folks in dual roles here today that are advisors, program directors, faculty as well. I cannot emphasize enough how important it will be for final grades to be submitted on time by faculty, which is 5 p.m. on December 8th. At that point, that's when the final grade entry in UNCG will be locked down, and students will not be able to opt into SAUS grading if they have not had a final grade assigned. So just know that that's sort of the gatekeep from the get-go. The academic relief package opt-in options will open in UNCG for students on December 9th. That's also when we'll have preliminary academic standing notifications will begin to be sent to students, with the emphasis that these are preliminary. So the University Registrar's Office sends academic standing notifications to students every semester when they've fallen out of good standing. So on warning, academic probation, suspension, or dismissal. The notifications will go out on December 9th, even with the emphasis that it is a preliminary notification. It will emphasize to students that the academic relief package is available to them and that they would likely benefit most from opting in. It'll encourage them to talk with you all about their options, but just know that those notifications will go to students. And then the advisor review will really sort of officially begin, but continue on a rolling basis December 11th. Which I'll talk obviously more about the logistics of the advisor review, but that's sort of the first official kickoff date where students will have had a couple of days to opt in, and your advisor review can begin. December 17th is the academic suspension and dismissal appeal deadline, and I will come back and talk about this in just a minute. That's why my asterisks are there to remind me to come back to it. Students have until December 23rd, which is this 2 weeks? 2 weeks to be able to opt in to the academic relief package deadline. So it is December 23rd. It will be 11:59 p.m. that night, similar to other deadlines that we have at UNCG. It'll be 11:59 p.m. to opt in and make their selections in UNCG. The advisor review will be able to continue until the end of the day on January 6th. So student selections will essentially be locked in when the university closes for the break, but it will give advisors time to continue the review after the university reopens from the semester break starting January 4th. I know it doesn't give you all a lot of time. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to give, but you'll continue to have that flexibility. I'm really hopeful that with some strategic messaging, we can encourage students to opt in early so that we can take advantage of those early days of review while the system remains open for students. But you all will have that little bit of buffer through the day of January 6th to conclude your review. January 8th is the official ARP opt-out deadline for students. So essentially what will happen is that as part of your review, when there are students that you're concerned about, they may have made poor choices, they need to reconsider, or they at least need to double check that these are the right choices that they really want to make, that advice will go out to students with instruction for, if they decide they need to reverse their choice, instructions for opting back out. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a little bit. And then sort of the official conclusion to the academic relief package timeline is January 11th, when academic standing will be rerun by the registrar's office and updated notifications will be sent to all students. They'll be sent to students that have perhaps returned to good standing because of the opt-in selections that they've made, and they will be either sent or resent to students who remain on academic probation or suspension and dismissal, as well as academic warning. All right, I'm checking out the chat. There was a question about, can we be sure to share this graphic and timeline with the units? We'll definitely be sure to do that, Gail. And there's also a question about confirming that all other typical grade replacement policies apply. Yes. So think of the flexibility offered by grade replacement as an overlay to our existing policy, but all of the other normal requirements or guidelines for the for grade replacement policy still apply. Good questions. So I almost forgot, but my asterisks reminded me that we want to loop back and talk just very briefly about the academic suspension and dismissal appeal deadline. I just want to acknowledge that in an ideal world, the academic appeal deadline would come after the ARP closes for students, after the review and after academic standing is rerun. But even with the delay of the spring semester, we just don't have the time to be able to do that. So what I want to emphasize that I think is important for you to emphasize to students that you're working with is that if students find themselves on academic suspension or dismissal when that preliminary notification goes out from the university registrar's office, even if they opt in to ARP selections that they anticipate and you anticipate will change their academic standing, my strong recommendation is that they still continue to plan and submit an academic appeal if they're planning to remain enrolled at UNCG in the spring. So even if we think that their academic standing will change as a result of their ARP selections, to cover all of their bases, they really need to plan on submitting an academic appeal. That is vetted through the student's first office, and as records are updated and standing is updated, we will pull appeals that no longer need to be reviewed or considered by the committee, but we simply just didn't have the flexibility to be able to move that deadline at all. So similar to when a student goes through grade replacement or a grade appeal or some other administrative process that they anticipate might change their grade and then change their standing, to cover all of their bases, if they're hoping to be enrolled in spring, they're on academic suspension or dismissal at that preliminary notification, they need to plan on submitting a full appeal. I'm seeing a good question from Mitch in the chat about the SAUS request, and I'm going to ask, let's hold off on that question for just a minute, because I think we'll hit that here in just a little bit, and be sure to distribute that information widely as well for folks that aren't here today. Okay, questions about the timeline? Okay. So obviously right now we're sort of in this holding pattern, and maybe we're doing some proactive advising. I know students are knocking down our doors, or maybe virtual doors, but sending lots of emails, asking lots of questions about what should I do, how do I do it, that kind of thing. And so obviously there are lots of resources out there for them and for you right now while they're awaiting their final grades and wrapping up their finals. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking through all of these, but just want to make sure that you all are aware of them. All the ones that you see listed here are available on our academic relief package website, which we've got the URL up there as well. Many of these were resources that were available in the spring and summer, which were helpful enough that we updated them and brought them back for this go around. The one new one that I will mention is this letter grade versus SAUS grading chart, which essentially gives students and you all a little more targeted information about, based on, if this is your letter grade, here's probably what's best for you with regard to opting into SAUS grades. So that's a new resource, and hopefully one that's very helpful to both you all and to students. One resource that we don't have yet, but will be coming very soon, is the list of academic programs that are prohibiting the SA grade from meeting program requirements, prerequisites, or secondary admission. That call for information was put out to departments and programs earlier this week, and they've been given or asked to complete that by the end of the day on Monday. So that will be a resource that's coming just in time for advisors with regard to the academic relief package. And likely, if you're working in areas with programs where this exclusion applies, I suspect you're already very aware of that, but we're going to have a centralized resource for everybody to be able to access, just so you can double check as you're doing your advisor review. All right, so next week we'll move into the next phase of the academic relief package with regard to the advisor review, which I think is probably what, like I said, has brought many of you all here today. So let's talk through the logistics of how this is being planned to work as of today. There will be what we're calling advisor review reports that will be shared through the School and College Advising Centers beginning December 9th. Obviously, December 9th is the day that the academic relief package opens for students in UNCG. But lists will begin being generated with all the students that have made opt-in selections beginning December 9th. And then we'll continue on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule through January 4th. So we'll likely have those first advisor review reports available towards the end of the day on December 9th, but then we'll run it again on December 11th, which is why we sort of marked that as the official begin of advisor review. And again, updated 3 times a week through December 23rd, and then one final time on January 4th to capture sort of any of those late day selections that students made just before the university closure. So those advisor review reports will be shared with the School and College Advising Centers starting the 9th. We will have all of this information in a central shared box folder that will be accessible to the centers, and then the centers can share those out as is appropriate for how sort of advising works in their unit as they see fit. So particularly if you're a faculty advisor, I would encourage you to check with the director of your advising center for sort of additional logistical considerations, since that will look very different across our schools and colleges. But we're sort of starting from that central point with our advising centers. We're gonna try to operate on an advisor review outreach model that's kind of a 2-tiered model. For those of you who've been involved in our registration outreach that we do every semester across all of our advising centers, it will be somewhat similar in nature. Our goal here is that as much as possible to document the outreach and recommendations that have been made, or at least that students have been flagged and told, hey, you may need to reconsider a choice that might be bad, or that they've made potentially bad choices. That will begin with the advising center and departmental advisor outreach. The goal with those reports is that students will be flagged in the reports that are shared on this recurring basis, or cumulative basis. So we'll be adding students to those reports every time those are updated. That students will be flagged as potentially needing to rethink their choice. And then a second round of outreach will go out on a recurring basis from the Division of Student Success as a way to sort of centrally capture and make part of a student's record that they were perhaps advised that their ARP selections were not in their best interest. It's important that we keep that kind of on a long-term basis, because we expect that students will maybe have buyer's regret of their choices long into the future as they're applying to graduate, or when they get to the point of admission into a program, that kind of thing. So we want to try to have as much sort of central record keeping as possible, knowing that that is difficult in an advising setting like ours at UNCG, where we do handle things and need to handle things differently across our schools and colleges. But that is the plan for both levels of outreach. So both within the advising centers or from the departmental advisors, and within the Division of Student Success Outreach. We will have email templates that are available to any and all of you to use, that based on sort of the scenarios that we're going to talk about here in just a minute, of the sort of main reasons why we would advise a student to reconsider their options, and in directions on next steps should they choose to take you up on that advice. And the other thing that I think is really important to emphasize with the advisor review is that we will continue to do what we do, which is advise. At the end of the day, ultimately, it's the student's decision whether or not to stick with the selections they've made with SAUS grading, or to take the advice or heed the warning that maybe has come from their advisor of reversing that choice. I know there was a lot of questions in the beginning of, are we just advising? Are we gatekeeping? Are we permitting? But students will opt in. We'll give it another look. And make sure, try to capture anything that is glaringly a poor choice. And then, but ultimately still students will have be the deciding factor in whether or not they'll stick with those USSA grade options. Questions? All right. So let's talk through scenarios in which you might advise students to consider reversing course and opting out.
Dana?
Yes.
I'm sorry. You're doing a fantastic job. But I'm just, and this is going to be off topic a little bit. So if you wanted to say, Aaron, go away, I will, because I listen to you all the time. But this seems like a heck of a lot of work for advisors. This seems like a heck of a lot of work for faculty. Unbelievable work by your office and the other offices to even get this off the ground running. So absolutely kudos to you and your staff. You guys deserve more than I can possibly tell you. My concern is, as we keep moving forward, is this has seemed to be an 11th hour decision with very little input on our end from the logistical standpoint of, by the way, we're doing this. Oh, and you guys have to figure out how to make it work in a 2-week time frame. I'm thinking this is going to happen again in the spring. And let's be honest, it's going to happen again in the summer. How much of a voice do we have as advisors to prevent this from happening? And I don't want to go all the way back to like how we got to this point, because I know that's kind of water under the bridge. But if it's really just students coming in the 11th hour in the summer also and saying, hey, we're not doing well, we need another ARP. And I know it's all about the students. Like, do we have a voice at the table to say, logistically, this is adding a ton to our winter break when we're trying to prep for courses and we're trying to get students through? And again, if this is going to take us completely off a sidetrack and way too much historical context, I will yield the time back. But it seems like they didn't figure out the logistics of this. They said, by the way, we made this unilateral decision and now you guys fix it. And that's really disheartening, because we're all about the students. And what it's really going to boil down to, and it's going to look bad on us as advisors because we don't have our stuff together, even though the students aren't going to see how this got dumped on us. And again, I will yield back, but I just had to say that because I've seen how much work you did. And I can't believe that we're in this position right now on December 3rd trying to figure this out. And I'm done now until 30 seconds later when I get fired up again.
Well, I know a lot of people have their cameras off, but I'm guessing you're probably getting like vigorous head nods and rounds of applause and that kind of thing, because I know that your concerns and frustrations are shared across the advising community. I think that we will do this again in the spring in at least within the context of the academic relief package, because the components of the academic relief package have been passed for both fall and spring. I do think there will absolutely be an opportunity and should be an opportunity for us as an advising community to sort of review once we get through the chaos and sort of debrief, okay, how did this work? We know we're going to have to do it again at the end of the spring. What do we need to do differently next time? I think you're right that it won't be smooth and that it will be easy to miss things given the very short amount of time that we've been given to sort of figure all this out. I think the benefit of the university is that there are very few mistakes that when mistakes are made, that we can't go back and sort of figure out a solution. So I always sort of embrace that. Although we don't want to continue to tweak students' records till infinity. As far as a voice, I think I will say that the advising council was given a very minimal heads up that this was really coming to the floor of Faculty Senate, and unanimously positioned against the academic relief package for reasons that I won't necessarily get into, but many of which were the questions or concerns that you voiced. I think really our only voice is the faculty senators within our units that will continue to consider these requests and consider any calls from the Student Government Association to extend academic relief into future semesters. Ultimately, this is an academic policy, and academic policy falls to the purview of the Faculty Senate. And even though the logistics of it don't necessarily fall to the purview of the Faculty Senate. So I think that's the best answer that I can give in the moment, without sort of rabbit trailing too far.
I appreciate that. And again, I agree with Jennifer and Nancy who have posted. I'm actually going to post right now. I think we need to keep track of how many hours we're working on this, how many hours, how many emails, how much manpower that we are devoting to this in a time when we already had budgeted in our workload to do other things. I'm a faculty member, so I have to prep for my summer courses, and now I'm going to be having to deal with this over winter break. So thank you so much for acknowledging that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for those of you who maybe haven't seen the chat, Nancy made a great suggestion that we should track how many students actually follow our review advice. As a way to measure the value of our work. We can absolutely do that, and the process that's in place for students to sort of reverse those choices will automatically give us that information. I think that speaks to the importance of tracking when we have given students the feedback in those advisor review reports so that we have accurate data to show. I had actually already thought, this is to Jennifer Rich's comment, if the data shows students don't follow our advice, can we revise this process for the spring? And I was going to ask Tammy Draves, is the chair of the Academic Policies and Regulations Committee, which was also very conflicted, did not actually support the academic relief package that ended up being adopted by Faculty Senate, for what it's worth. But if we could give an update to the Faculty Senate sometime in the early spring about the outcomes of the relief package, because I think, hearing directly from us, from you all, will be the best, again, to use Aaron, your words, the best way to sort of get a voice at the table for any tweaks or changes that need to be made moving forward. So Mitch asked a great question about a situation where a student has multiple advisors. Is only the primary advisor in charge of the first outreach? Yes, I think, for that distinction where the advising reports that will be coming through the schools and colleges are sort of prioritizing the feedback from the primary advisor. But you're right that there may be some feedback from secondary advisors that could be conflicting to students. I think hopefully that's where sort of these centralized resources for differences across programs will come into place. And I think also where the advising centers and the students first office will be important. But you're right, it's complicated when we know our students have multiple majors, minors across units that make sort of the feedback different. I think the good thing is maybe in some ways that's where the SAUS limit is helpful, because there's only sort of so much perhaps damage students can do and advisors can do in their review, because there's not going to be a full schedule worth of SAUS grades to review every single time. The maximum of 2 grades will be at play. And the goal with those advisor review reports, and I don't have a sample to show you because we're building the plane as we're flying it, but is that we've been very intentional about the information that is included in those, so that really as advisors we have a snapshot to quickly review all the components that kind of fall into these scenarios of why we might advise a student to opt out of their initial choice. So it will include all of their majors and minors. It will include what course they've opted into US grading for. It will include both their original grade and their opt-in grade. It will include their GPA and their academic standing. So I know that sounds like a lot of information, but it's intended to essentially quickly be able to provide a snapshot so that we're not having to dig into every single student's individual record, looking at every single degree works to make some sort of blanket guidance for students. All right, I think a lot of chats are coming through, so give me just a second to take a look here. Oh, Amanda has offered to help with the data tracking. Be careful what you wish for, Amanda, but we'll definitely reach out about that. Julie, your question about Starfish is a good one. Truthfully, it's one that I thought of this morning when I was sort of taking a final look at things, which is probably the epitome of like how we're figuring this out on the fly, that good ideas come a little bit later. I honestly don't know. I think that is a great idea. The benefit of Starfish is that it sort of automatically centralizes that feedback in one location, and it also could potentially automate sending that to students. I worry about what that might mean for our larger advising centers that could quickly log feedback in a spreadsheet form versus access in students individually in Starfish. So I'd be curious what other centers think about that. It was an idea, like I said, that came to me very early this morning, but is maybe one that we could still have time to consider, particularly if our larger centers felt like that might be a mechanism. Starfish right now is used differently and at different levels across the university. So that's something to consider too. Okay. Aaron, to your question about SSIL students, they'll work with their SSIL advisor. Okay. All right. I'm taking another look here. If I've missed something, y'all feel free to unmic and catch me. Okay. So let's talk about the scenarios in which we might advise students to consider reversing course and opting out. There's some buckets that I think we've been able to identify. The first, if there's the potential loss of needed credit. So this would be students that are in academic good standing and opted into a US grade when they originally had a passing grade of a D+, D, or D-. I will say that for the most part, US grades are the problem. They really help students that really struggled, but they can also cause a lot of problems for students that like take them willy-nilly or don't understand that by opting into a US grade, they're opting into 0 credit. It's as though they withdrew from the course. And that was a big misunderstanding for many students in spring and summer and resulted in buyer's regret. I emphasize academic good standing here because for our students who are on probation or suspension or dismissal, a lot of times their opt-in selections are the difference between eligibility and ineligibility to continue their enrollment. And so while D grades are passing, it's not good enough for them to remain eligible to continue. So really academic good standing is important, and as well as if they've applied to graduate, that's really important. We had a number of students in spring and summer who had applied to graduate, opted into US grades, and then that interfered with their ability to graduate on time. So this is sort of the first big scenario bucket for students that are facing the potential loss of needed credit that they're not prepared or not realizing that they'll have to retake in the future. Questions about that? The second scenario is a little more ambiguous, but a potential delay in time to degree because they've opted into an SA grade and they're declared in an academic program that is elected to exclude the SA grades from meeting those requirements. As of right now, as of this morning, there was only a handful of programs across campus that have logged that they plan to elect to exclude SA grades from meeting prerequisites or meeting major requirements, or from allowing students to qualify for secondary admission. So again, if I'm hopeful that if you're advising within those programs, you already know that. I think that that will be more important particularly for professional advisors that work across programs to be aware of. And that's the resource that's forthcoming. That we'll have available at the end of the day on Monday, of all of the programs that have elected to exclude SA grades from meeting prerequisites. But if they opt in, if a student is declared in one of those programs and opted into an SA grade that's required for a course that's required for one of those programs, that's a warning message that needs to go out to those students and a flag that needs to be made for those students. Questions about that? Nursing's an example. There's some programs in the School of Ed that are examples. I know there's one course in particular for a program in the Bryan School. So a couple across each of our, several of our schools and colleges, but many departments have made the decision to just accept the SA grade for another round, particularly because of the difficulty in sort of tracking that long term. The next scenario is one where there's the potential loss of good grades. I'm not sure if you all saw this a lot in the students that are in your caseload, but we did have quite a number of students in the spring and summer who received good grades, A and B grades, or particularly A- and B+ grades, but opted into the SA grade as a way to sort of protect their GPA. So they calculated that even a B+ grade might reduce their GPA incrementally, or it might have them lose their 4.0 cumulative GPA. And so they opted into the SA grade as a way to accept that. But I think what's really important to emphasize to students, and I suspect that all of us know this, but not all students know this, is that generally speaking, a letter grade, 90% of the time, a letter grade, regardless of what that letter grade is, if it's good enough to get an essay grade, it's good enough to keep. The exception to that, I think, is particularly C minuses because of our program requirements that require C or better, especially if those programs are allowing an essay to meet that requirement. But if a student's gotten an A grade or a B grade, they really should keep that letter grade, particularly because we don't know the long-term impacts of that for graduate school or professional school once they graduate from UNCG.
Dana, can I add one thing about the good grades being changed to essay?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Maria.
Yes, so I'm Maria. I work in the registrar's office. One of my areas is degree clearance. And something we're seeing is students attempting to meet the requirements for Latin honors. The essays do not count towards the minimum credit hours for Latin honors. And so if you have students so focused on their high GPA, they may actually be losing out on certain honors that they expect to get. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Perfect. Thanks, Maria. Amanda asked a question in the chat about, will this PowerPoint be shared in the advisor resources area of the SFO site? That is actually not an area that I had thought of posting it, but we can absolutely do that. I think that's a great suggestion. So we'll plan to add that. It will be this, we will put this in the box file space where we'll have the advisor review reports, and we'll post it in some various places on the website as well, so everybody's got access to that. There's also a new Advisor Academy website where we house all things related to coffee and conversations, and it will be there as well. So we'll definitely make sure this is widely distributed.
Hey, Dan, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Just for clarification. I'm sorry, everybody.
No, you're great. Go ahead.
So theoretically, you could have a freshman this semester, first semester freshman, and they opt into an essay, right? And if we as a program say we're not accepting that essay, we would have to keep manually checking for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. As long as there's a student who potentially has an essay in their transcript, we have to make sure we're always checking to see if that essay is there, right? This isn't just like we check for one semester. We could have to be checking this for years to come because of a decision made this semester in spring. Am I misinterpreting that and being more gloom and doom, or is that accurate?
No, I think that's accurate. Because we can't, what's the word I'm looking for? We can't technically sort of program it in Banner because the essay grade already was designed in a specific way last spring. It can't be sort of centrally managed. So you're right, departments who would opt in to deciding we're not going to allow the essay grade, it's completely going to be internal to that department for tracking and monitoring for years to come.
So we'd have to like pull the course the class rosters and then go through each class roster to see if anybody maybe in a prereq course has an essay in a prereq. I don't even know how that would actually look. It could get, and again, that could be program specific, but it could be really ugly, right?
Yeah, I think it could get really messy. Maria, I don't know if you have thoughts on that to share from a registrar prerequisite monitoring perspective, but you're right. There's nothing that won't prevent students with essay grades from registering for courses in a program that excluded it.
So that could be big for prereqs.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible for the rosters for people who have essay grades in those classes to be produced and sent so that departments don't have to go looking for that information, but that it can be sent to them?
I mean, I think wouldn't you have to theoretically pull every single roster from every course? Because you could have one student who essayed. Yeah, I don't know. And again, this is why I'm really worried about accepting the essay, because this is going to be happening to our advisors long after I'm gone.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if the registrar's office has a better idea, or if anyone here has a better idea how to track this stuff, I'd love to hear it. We can talk at Odin Brewery.
Socially distant, of course.
Socially distanced. They have an outdoor thing with picnic tables.
Yeah, I think that probably becomes like a next phase of, but that programs really should sort of enter into this decision knowing that it's yet another logistic that you're going to have to make the decision before we have the logistics figured out, and there will be limitations to the logistics. So like, how feasible does that really feel in kind of a worst case scenario to departments, is what I would say, my non-faculty perspective. Adam asked a good question. Is this recommendation up to advisor opinion or a line advisors should toe? I can empathize with students wanting to keep their 4.0. That's a great question. I think these are intended to give specific sort of categories of things to look for. This might fall into what's on the next slide real quick, which is more so a softer warning and referral. So maybe, so to your point, perhaps it doesn't have to be a toe the line, or maybe that's a little bit more subjective for advisors. Again, remember, we're advising, we're not permitting. So perhaps it's just a little bit of a softer message if sort of that's your perspective. And it could be good to just give students a heads up of, hey, it looks like you've opted in. I'm guessing it's because you want to protect your GPA. Generally, the general recommendation always is that A and B grades are better than essay grades, particularly since there's so much we don't yet know. And then students can decide what they will with that. I don't know if others of you have thoughts on sort of how to respond to that question from Adam. Different opinions. Okay. So those are sort of the big, what I would call the big buckets. I'm curious if there are scenarios you've thought of that you don't see represented here that you think would be important to share for the group. Anything?
One of the things that college students are looking at is if they know they don't have the grade they need to, and they're going to have to retake the course, whether it might be better to go ahead and take a US if they're going to have to retake it. And that may go back to the financial aid issue, which you may be covering later, but I think that's a tricky one when students know they're going to have to repeat a course, even if it is a passing grade.
Right, yes, and I think that is a perfect segue into this softer warning and referral, which would be for students that opted into a US grade with an original grade of a D+, D, or D-, and they're receiving financial aid. Because the big concern from a financial aid perspective is students who initially were earning credit and now they are not. And that's exactly what happens when they had a D grade of some kind and opted into the US grade. And that's, I think, challenging for everybody because students really need to weigh, okay, what's the academic benefit of opting into the US grade? And sometimes even perhaps the financial aid benefit. Financial aid may slap me on the wrist for saying that. Because of course, financial aid won't pay for a class for you to repeat a course that you've earned credit in. So keeping the D grade has financial aid ramifications. Opting into the US grade potentially has financial aid ramifications as well. So students really need to talk with the experts in both areas about what are the academic benefits of a choice and what are the financial aid ramifications of a choice. And that's where I think the importance of a softer warning and referral to financial aid is really critical so that students have that financial aid expertise. Now that means they can't totally discount the academic piece as well. But that's an important thing to consider for sure. And I might come back to your comment too, Nancy, because I think, that's about students making smart opt-in choices as well, which we can talk about. But you're right, if a student knows that even with opting in, they're still going to need to retake the course, isn't there benefit in opting in because it potentially protects their GPA or even their standing. And then a softer warning and referrals to students in these specific areas. So student athletes, international students, or military affiliated students. I know we've got some folks, I think we've got some folks from athletics on the call today. We may have from the other areas as well. But because no credit has additional ramifications for students that fall into one of these populations, it'll be really important to refer students accordingly to athletics for their NTA certification, to international programs, or to our Office of Military Affiliated Services. So, and the advising reports that I keep mentioning, it will also indicate if a student falls into any of these categories. And the students that do fall into these categories will be shared with these departments as well, just so they're aware of students that they may need to support in that capacity. True. All right, let me get caught up on these questions. So Kristen asked a question about, has there been any guidance regarding other UNC system schools and if they will or will not accept codes from our academic relief package? Maria, I don't know if you have any insight on that. I know that UNCG as an institution has been struggling with that same question about how we will or will not accept satisfactory, unsatisfactory grading. Satisfactory, I guess, specifically from other institutions, because frankly, other UNC institutions had different criteria for what could be an essay grade or not.
Currently when we see those on transcripts, our transfer team is going to the website similar to our ARP website of the institution and seeing what letter grades were allowed for a satisfactory grade. And if it is below a C-, we are not accepting it as transfer credit at this point. That is subject to change as we get more guidance either from the system or from administration at UNCG. But I would imagine other schools are struggling with this. We have not seen anything on like the registrar listserv with any kind of consistency right now.
So again, speaks to the messiness of any opting in to SAUS grading from that respect. So Abigail asked, can a student take a US and then do a grade replacement for that US grade? The short answer is no, because the benefit of grade replacement is that it excludes the original grade, the grade that's being replaced, from calculating into the student's GPA. It remains on the student's transcript, even if it's not calculated. So there really wouldn't be any benefit at all. It'd be a waste of a grade replacement to replace a US grade, because that US grade is already not factoring into a student's GPA because they didn't earn a grade and they didn't earn credit hours for it. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So let's talk briefly about what we know about the opt-out process as of right now. So all students, regardless of when their advisor review or outreach occurs, so remember you all have got through the 6th to kind of wrap up these loose ends. They'll be given until 5 p.m. on January 8th to reverse course and opt out. And I want to emphasize that opting out is different from changing their selection. So all they can do through the opt-out process is based on the feedback that you maybe have given them, is they can say, okay, I opted into an essay grade, I want my letter grade back. Or I opted into a US grade, I want my letter grade back. They can't say, but now I'd like to use the essay grade for this course instead. So all they can do is roll back. They can't redistribute. Does that make sense? Okay, because I'd just get real messy. And we'd really be doing this for decades. If a student takes no action, so whether you didn't reach out to them because you didn't think you needed to, or you reached out to them and they didn't heed the advice, which is something we chatted about earlier, the essay US selections they've made will remain on their transcript and won't be reversed. So once that January 8th deadline passes for the masses, they're locked in. If there's issues, we'll deal with them, going back to something I said earlier. But if students take no action on the feedback or outreach that's been given to them, suggesting that they might want to reconsider, they'll stay locked in on their transcript.
So Dana, if they are wanting to opt in for a different course, what would that deadline be? So it sounds like it would be, you know, beneficial for us to get that advising review done as quickly as possible. If we see another course, they should maybe opt in for satisfactory.
Yeah, so I think that goes back to that's why students need to be proactive, because they only have 2. They need to use it wisely, and the best way to use it wisely is to make sure they have sort of vetted their choices before they ever select them. The opt-out process is only to roll back, again, not to redistribute. So when they make their opt-in selections, that's when they've essentially locked themselves into using them for those courses. They can only roll it back. They can't redistribute.
So if they rolled one back in time to redistribute, could they?
No.
Okay.
Yep. Once they click submit in Genie, they're locked in to having used their 2 for those 2 courses. They can roll it back for those 2 courses, but they can't use them for different courses. I hope that makes sense. I feel like that's not very clear.
No, it makes perfect
Okay.
sense. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
No, that's a big deal. So
Yeah, it is.
hopefully they're reaching out to us before they even do that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Dana, I think it makes sense, but it seems like a lot stricter policy to be applied to students than faculty. If faculty make a clerical error, they can do grade changes without a lot of punitive impact.
Mm-hmm.
But if a student accidentally selects the wrong thing in a drop down and clicks submit, then it's like dead in the water, no fixing. It seems like a weird standard to hold students to, but not faculty to.
Yeah, well, I think my 2 responses to that are the Genie system is set up so that they have to confirm their choices. So there's at least that stop. It's not just like submit and done. They'll submit. The system will ask, these are your choices. Are you sure? They'll submit again. So there is that. But I also think that what I hear Britt asking about is different from a mistake, but more so they've gotten advice from an advisor or from financial aid that you might want to roll back this choice. And they're like, okay, yeah, I'll take the letter grade, but now I want to use the SAUS grade over here instead. And that's not what the opt-out process is going to allow. Because really what's intended here is we knew we couldn't do an advisor review and automate the SAUS selections at the same time. So we have to do it reactively instead of proactively. And we just can't keep shuffling the selections around, because then that would almost start the advisor review over again. Okay, so now they've selected this one. That would go back to you all for review, and we'd just sort of be in this cyclical process. All right, so opt-out requests will come to the Division of Student Success and the University Registrar's Office via an online request, which is called the ARP exception request. And that a link to that form will be in the email templates that are provided to you all as advisors for you to use when you're doing the outreach, either through the centers or through individual advisors. And any of those kind of rollbacks are manual. So when students opt in Genie, it will automatically change their process or change their transcript thanks to Magic in ITS. But if they decide to roll things back, that's where it becomes a manual update to their record, to their course grade, to their GPA calculation, and also their academic standing. So that's kind of a quick snapshot of how that process works. And then I'll just emphasize that all ARP exception requests, they're really for processing only. There won't be an additional vetting of the student's rollback. So student makes a selection in Genie, you all review and advise otherwise, student decides to roll it back and it gets processed. There's not an additional review there. So that kind of speaks to the importance of students knowing what they're rolling back from, what they're opting out from. And in full disclosure, the ARP exception request hasn't been finalized yet, like what that looks like. So that will sort of be that will be important to that process to make sure students are able to clearly indicate what they're changing. But we'll get that in place before next week. And so no further review will be done, and opt-outs cannot be reversed once they're sent to the registrar's office. Sierra asked a really good question about, do they have to choose their two at the same time? Or if a student chooses one course earlier and one course later, that should be fine. I think that's what, maybe things jumped there. So when students log into UNC Genie, all of their final grades will be posted, and they'll have to make a choice at that time. So any courses that they see listed will have their final grade, and then they need to select if they'll keep their final grade or if they'll opt into the appropriate SAUS grading. So because that's why it's intentionally being made available after the final grade deadline, so that students will, in theory, have all of their final grades there, but they have to make both choices at the same time. So if they're not sure about one, they should wait until they're ready to make choices about two. Or maybe they're only going to opt into one, and that's fine. But if they're still trying to make a decision about something, they should wait and not submit their opt-in selections until they're absolutely final. That was different from in summer because there were these different parts of term, and so final grades were appearing at different times. But in a fall or a spring semester, when all final grades for courses are up there, they have to log their decision at the same time. Nancy asked a good question. Hold on, maybe I'm missing questions here. Let's see. Nancy asked a question about, will UNC Genie unofficial transcript recalculate the GPA during religious time up to December 23rd? Real. This is what comes from me reading the question in real time.
I think so, but I'm double checking.
Yeah, I think it refreshes like every 30 minutes. So it may not be real time, but it will be updated within like the hour. And if I'm remembering correctly, since Maria is checking, there's a message in Genie that says if your GPA has not been updated, it will be within the hour. Maria, if you find something else out, you let us know. Okay. So real briefly, and Nancy mentioned this in one of her comments earlier, we've spent a lot of time advising students for how to opt out, and I think that's primarily because the advisor review is coming after the fact. There is effort to help students make choices in terms of opting in that we're going to be handling specifically within the Students First office. Many of you all know that our office works with students in academic recovery, so on probation, suspension, or dismissal. And so we'll be doing some outreach, particularly to students on suspension and dismissal who may benefit from opting in. We're also going to be doing some centralized outreach for opting in to all students with F grades, because F grades are pretty clear cut. An F grade doesn't count as credit. It's hurting their GPA. And a US grade will benefit their GPA, but not be any more detrimental to things like financial aid and that kind of thing. So we'll be doing some outreach starting next week to students in those categories. So just wanted to make you aware of those. All right, so January 8th, which is after the deadline for students to opt in. I mentioned this earlier, but URO will make, the registrar's office will make updates to student records on a rolling basis as those are sort of coming through with the ARP exception process. Are selections really final? Yes, as much as anything's final at the university, you're final. I will mention that the traditional course withdrawal requests still exist. They'll have up to a year to appeal. And many students, again, I mentioned this very briefly earlier, but may opt into a US grade and then decide that they still want to go through a withdrawal process later, and that's absolutely fine. There's no reason why they can't do that. They won't see an impact to their GPA or their academic standing necessarily because that remains the same, but I think a lot of students and probably advisors agree that a withdrawal generally looks better probably on a transcript than a US grade, which of course would indicate to whoever's looking at the transcript that the student earned at least a D or an F. The ARP exception process will likely remain open a while longer on a case-by-case basis for students with grade appeals or other administrative processes. My hope is that we can sort of shut the door on this by February 1st, but I'll keep you all as advisors updated on how that process shapes out once we see sort of how messy things get or don't get in terms of the opting in and the rolling back and what grades maybe remain in flux even after those posted deadlines. I'll emphasize again that updated academic standing notifications will be sent to students on January 11th, again by the registrar's office. These will be sent to students who return to good standing and also those who will essentially will continue or remain or be on academic probation, suspension, or dismissal pending their appeal, which of course was due back on December 17th. And as an FYI, although maybe impacting a relatively small number of students, the appeals committee will meet on January 13th to review all of those appeals. Again, we'll pull out the ones that are no longer applicable as standing is updated, but decisions will be sent to students on that same day. And so that's how we make sure things are hopefully wrapped up as much as possible before spring classes will start the following week. All right, what questions haven't I answered? In the 6 minutes we have remaining, we've covered a lot today.
Dana, with kind of going back to good grades questions.
Yes.
So if I have a student, this is a scenario I ran into last week with an appointment on probation, and they're taking 3 classes and expecting 3 C's. Would you recommend 2 satisfactories and them take a withdrawal for a C to not be suspended? Or would you recommend them take 2 satisfactories a C and then be suspended because their term GPA is below a 2.3.
Yeah. Oh, you're warping my brain today, Adam. So I would say, first of all, remember that they can't withdraw. That's not an they can, but through the traditional process, which takes time. It's not something that they'll be able to select in Genie, and it requires a committee review. That's a big change from spring and summer. So if you've got if you've got a student on probation with 3 Cs, which would mean they would be facing suspension, I think my advice for these students and academic recovery team folks who are on this call, feel free to chime in. I think it would depend on, they can't save their quote unquote save their eligibility by opting in. So then I think the question becomes, would their cumulative GPA be helped by opting into essay grades, or would it hurt, or would it remain the same because they've got C's across the board? If they get better impact on raising their GPA from keeping the C's, I think they need to keep the C's and still plan to go through the appeal process for the academic suspension committee. But if there's any sort of hindrance to their GPA from opting in or not opting in, that might be where there would be guidance or importance for them to utilize them. Does that help?
Yeah.
Recovery, you got
so
anything
like
to
if they
say?
were only in 2 classes, and C's would help their GPA, but they'd go on suspension, they should take the satisfactories without the GPA help. But with 3, maybe take the GPA help, but then be on suspension.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime there's, if the grades are improving their GPA and increasing them slowly, incrementally back to the 2.0 that they need to be in good standing, keep the grades, is what I would say. Academic recovery folks, this is your area of expertise. Do you have anything to add?
I would just say that on the Students First website, we do have a GPA calculator to utilize when you want to kind of test this out with the student. So I would highly encourage everyone to use that when talking through different circumstances with students. Again, like Dana was saying, to see how those satisfactory grades would impact their GPA, but how would keeping the C's impact it as well. So that GPA calculator is on our website within the ARP web page that we have on our website. So I would highly encourage using that as well.
But I think, I mean, just quickly summarize, I would just say, I think anytime, even if incrementally, keeping the grade, the letter grade, improves their GPA, keep the grade. And then the appeals committee will evaluate it as such. The C grades are hard for the appeals committee anyway, because they're so close. Any other questions?
Dana, this is Sierra. Ooh, gravelly voice this morning. May I return to my question one more time? Because I may have missed one part of your answer about when students select their choices on changing their classes. Did you say that in the system, that the system itself won't let the student change one now and change one later, or will the system allow that? Because I'm just thinking of the timing. A student think about it, you know, they'll make a change and then they'll think about it and say later, ooh, I do want to change a second, and then go in and try to change a second. Were you saying the system won't allow that, or?
Right, the system won't allow that. The system requires that they need to wait until they're ready to make their final choices regarding one or both. And they'll click submit one time. They can't go back in and make another choice.
Okay, I had missed that last part. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I know. And I know I wish technically speaking it could be different, because I think that, you know, that would help students realize things more quickly. But yep, they have to lock it in. Okay, everyone. I know we're running short on time. So if you did not have a chance to sign in today, if you came in later, please be sure to sign in just so I can have record of everybody that was here today. I think you've all asked some really great questions. I appreciate the flexibility for questions that were more difficult to answer. But if you've got other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. Again, I'm the director in the Students First office. For those of you who aren't as familiar with me, I'll look forward to working with you. And we will definitely plan, at least in a coffee and conversation scenario, a debrief once all this is over in the early spring to get your feedback, and we'll tweak things moving forward, as well as share our experiences with the Faculty Senate. So I just want to say I'm very grateful for you all and your willingness, or perhaps reluctance, even if that, for being on this ride. I know it's going to be a hectic month. But I know we all are keeping sort of our students and their success at the forefront. So thank you all so much. We'll see what comes in the next couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody.